All right, welcome, welcome. My name is Garrett Monroe, and I'm here with Dr. Maryanne Conan. Hello. Welcome back, folks. We're here with Tabletop EDU's first course series, and this lesson is on beyond gamification, understanding game-based learning. So today we have a couple different learning objectives. We're going to talk about some foundational ideas behind some of our philosophy and approach with using tabletop RPGs for teaching and learning. And we're going to give you a little bit of a preview of some of the other big ideas in this course. So it's going to be something of a smorgasbord. I'm going to speak for a little bit. Maryanne is gonna play kind of devil's advocate or side host and chip in and add some examples or ask some questions, and then we're going to trade seats, and then she's going to take over and lead further into the lesson.
Okay, just for a second, I did think you said side hoe.
Oh, no,
No, side
no,
host. Yes.
not Sido. No, side host. Yes, we should clarify that because sometimes the audio doesn't pick everything up, and we might.
Okay, everybody, I hope you have your bingo cards out and your tallies because today we're going to be talking about Gary Allen Fine and Jim Paul G at some length, so you'll have to keep track of how many times we use their names and talk about each of them.
Yes, we all have our favorite hobby horses to ride,
Hmm.
academic or otherwise, not to get back into side hoe territory. Um, so yeah, I mean, welcome. We're so glad you're here. This is such an exciting time to be in a tabletop RPG nerd and also an educator. There's a real movement happening. So regardless of where you're coming from or why you're here, we're happy you're here and we want to hear from you. You know, the reason that this thing works is because we're trying to create a community of inquiry, as they say. We're trying to create a network, a professional learning network, and that hinges on exchange and traffic and collegiality. And so welcome if you're a TTRPG veteran, if you're just a curious educator, maybe you've never played a tabletop role-playing game before, but you're interested in new ways of engaging your students or teaching and learning. Maybe you're looking at using tabletop RPGs in a somewhat different space, like coaching or some space sort of co-curricular, extracurricular. You're all welcome here. We did start Tabletop EDU with the express interest of serving educators. And so we don't speak as much as other people in applied tabletop RPGs about things like counseling or therapy. So we really want to focus on teaching and learning specifically.
We're really hoping to be in a space kind of between practitioners and theorists. There's a lot of great theory out there. There's a lot of great academics doing important work. And there's also a lot of educators out there doing important work. And sometimes they don't talk to each other. So hopefully, by taking a look at what we're talking about here in this lesson series, you will be able to start to bridge that gap.
Yeah, it's a meeting of the tribes. Yeah, and that's one group who wasn't at this table graphic, what were academics and researchers. So we also welcome you folks. And that bridge work that Maryanne mentioned is really important. And it's also a missing piece between practitioners and researchers. So
Big time.
that's definitely a part of our mission as well. Just to start things, tabletop RPGs are having a moment culturally. They're becoming sort of ascendant. It's entered the common parlance of people, and there's a number of different reasons, and we're not gonna, analyze it to death, but it might be something like the pandemic really pushed people to engage with tabletop RPGs with things like Discord or online play. It was a great, highly social way to connect with people during the pandemic. And then after the pandemic, as we came out, we began to realize more the value of being together in deep community and in deep play, which is what tabletop RPGs do really well. So since the pandemic, there's been just this surge of interest. Interest in D&D has risen by 85% since the pandemic. And it's not just, of course, in Dungeons and Dragons, but other tabletop RPGs. It's a growing market. Um, and what's interesting is when people become players, they become pretty committed to it, participating perhaps in weekly sessions and consistently over time. Young people are really,
62%, huh? 62% of TTRPG players participate in weekly sessions. I
I
think
mean,
that's
I
really,
was surprised by that stat.
I think it's great.
Yeah,
You know, I think we have a lot of concerns, as educators and human beings about the sort of fracturing of our society and how there seems to be less and less togetherness. But this is definitely a way that people are coming together and making and keeping friendships as adults, right? And it's really neat to see. I especially appreciate the growing diversity in, this is not just
yeah.
white neckbeards in their yeah, daddy's basement anymore, right? Not that it ever really was.
Well, yeah, I that the profile, the makeup of TTRPG players has changed,
Yeah,
and I don't think that I think that that also speaks to the power of this stuff in particularly around identity,
sure.
exploring identity. It's a space where people find a lot of strength and empowerment from, and so it might be that marginalized communities are drawn to it and can build on that on some of the inherent structures of tabletop RPGs. So there's a big conversation that others could launch into about why our TGR is having a moment, but they are, and you may find that your students are inherently drawn to it. And this is for us educators means this is one reason why it's an exciting moment for us to look at how might we incorporate it more deeply into our practice. I will say, and I get into this in a second, unlike some other popular cultural moments or phenomenon, TTRPGs have a steep learning curve. And so unlike, picking up a video game or downloading an album or something, it requires quite a lot of learning and growth. And so unlike even, a video game where you can pick it up and learn it, it's inherent. It's not with tabletop RPGs. So a lot of people are interested, but they haven't figured out a way to play. They want to play. And so again, that's going to help with this inherent motivation to play. Um, that being said, education's also having a moment. In the US, we're facing a lot of headwinds. It's a tough time to be in education, K-12 or higher ed. Again, post-pandemic, it just feels like it's been harder to reach students. This was my experience as a college professor teaching first year seminar. I thought
This
my
is my
students,
experience too as teaching fifth through eighth graders. I'm noticing you have here, student engagement, declining literacy, persistent absenteeism, and stagnant achievement as being some of the concerns. And I certainly see all of those things.
yeah,
In the public school, it's very challenging. The persistent absenteeism is a huge one, and the student disengagement is really big, right? And then from there, the declining literacy and stagnant achievement. And that's one of the things I love about
yeah.
TTRPGs is that they encourage that engagement and coming because you've got a party who's counting on you.
Yes. You feel like you matter. There's a relevancy, right? All of a sudden,
Yes.
perhaps, and it's something to do with that identity work, that powerful identity work that we're going to get into that TTRPGs offer students who maybe don't feel seen or a part of something or valued, but in the game fiction, in a shared game fiction with this alternate identity, it's a very different story. And so, yeah, the big takeaway here is TTRPGs might be an answer to some of this. There's no quick fixes to a lot of this stuff. Um, but for some students, and yeah, for some students, TTRPGs may be, a real transformative experience or activity that could really bring them back in to engage with schooling and learning. Yeah, and that was the case with me growing up, and so that's a whole different story. And I want to speak as we get into our first module here, our first kind of learning goals that I see this as a continuation of a long march of progressive education. So we continue in the tradition of John Dewey and Paolo Freire, and I'm going to add Jim Paul G, one of my favorites, of critical and progressive pedagogy. that is looking to create change in a system that doesn't necessarily work very well for very many people. And so Dewey spoke about this a little over 100 years ago when he wrote Democracy in Education. And he was very critical of institutional bureaucratic education, sort of industrial era, the sort of stuff that we see in our teacher prep programs of kids learning to be good workers or clerks or so forth. He understood education more as something like preparation for civic life, of being good, upstanding citizens. And education wasn't preparation for life or a career, but education is life itself. And so one of the things that's so exciting about having students involved in TTRPGs is they get to do the messy work of doing deliberation on sticky problems of like doing discussion and so forth. And Dewey, much has actually been written about Dewey, particularly in TTRPGs. Freire talked about pedagogy of the oppressed, and how, education often isn't built at all by the people that perhaps need it most. And so when you flip the script, when you turn the tables and you put the students in charge, what it changes things dramatically. What happens if students start to get to work on things that they really care about? And TTRPGs, are so participatory. The facilitator, and if we think of the game master as the educator, you're outnumbered, 1 to 5, 1 to 6, depending on your group. And all of a sudden, the students have a ton of voice and choice, like these words we use in good personalized education for where the story goes. And so Freire would have been a big fan, I think, of tabletop RPGs. And we'll get into a little more G, but I invite you into the revolution. Welcome to the movement, in what I think of as a disruptive in a good way development in critical and progressive pedagogy. So today, here's a couple learning objectives. It's to sort of define what are tabletop RPGs and understand them as a unique analog, social, and flexible learning tool. We're going to really distinguish these two terms, and this is a little bit of a hobby horse of mine. It's something of it's an academic artifact, but distinguishing between game-based learning or GBL and a word called gamification. And we're going to discuss components or the 7 properties of play. Later on, we're going to get into Jim Paul G's new literacies, and then we're going to get into the power of psychologically motivated learning environments in tabletop RPGs. And Maryanne is going to bring us into Gary Allen Fine and the game of school.
That's right, baby.
So, we're going to talk for a minute about what are tabletop RPGs, whether you're new to tabletop RPGs or you've been playing them for a while, like myself. There's a couple different ways of talking about this. In a word, and we're going to talk, I've kind of 3 different frames. So the first one is to think about tabletop RPGs as their own media. So if we think about tabletop RPGs versus music as like an art form or a media versus visual art like painting versus literature, we're going to elevate tabletop RPGs to be at the same level of these other media or art. And philosophers, and this is a book, a fantastic book if you're into this thing, by a guy named Nguyen, Games Agency as Art, who looked at games particularly from this lens of how are games really distinctive and different. And he settled on the word agency, where music manipulates sound and visual art manipulates color and patterns, and things like literature or drama manipulate narrative. They tell stories, static stories. Games manipulate agency, so they invite participants in to make different choices, make a series of different choices that have meaning consequences within that space. So they're unique in that way. They occupy a sort of unique space in human culture. Um, and so they're not just static story, but they're participatory storytelling where participants shape that world in real time. And he described it as artworks of agency that let us explore alternative modes of reasoning, collaboration, and identity. And he went further to discuss by playing different games, it actually helps you download whole libraries of different ways of thinking and acting in the world. And so if we think about playing different characters, different classes, different identities, it allows us to really, in a deep way, explore those modalities and change and there's some transfer. This is that important step where it transfers into our real world skill set or way of understanding the world or way of acting in the world.
And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more too later.
Oh, excellent. And this is built on some of Dewey's work as well. And Nguyen acknowledges this in his book. In Dewey's book, Art as Experience, he describes meaning arising through doing. And so and this is, we want to tie it to pedagogy. The phrase here is experiential learning, right? That we learn through doing, perhaps best. Dewey was a big fan of that. And so his vision of progressive schools in advanced democracies was to kind of tear the walls down of schools and have students out in the community. They're working on service projects. They're involved in, solving problems that were facing the community, real work, real problems, much more to sort of an apprentice model or an internship model or a service learning model. And he thought that was the most powerful, again, education as life itself, not prep for life. Tabletop RPGs are an interesting way to talk about or think about that because in a way some people might think about them as escapism and they're not, experiential in that very real way. But they're experiential in a different way, which is interesting, I think, which is to simulate other scenarios and opportunities that we couldn't access otherwise. So it's just logistically very challenging to coordinate having our students running all over the community and coordinate all that
Yeah,
learning. And
it's
so
super hard to coordinate a field trip to kill the dragon.
yeah, right, exactly. Or to go to space and or
Yeah.
play with a super collider or ride a rocket ship or all these amazing or the Miss Frizzle stuff of go down to the size of an ant and explore, things that we could never do in the real world. And yet some of these simulated experiences with a little imagination and some structure allow students to get what they need out of those experiences in still a deep and meaningful way. So, there's also a safety, besides cost and logistics and impossibility, there's a safety concern too. So, and we're not suggesting tabletop RPGs are the only way to run it. Like, we wouldn't suggest running a whole school based on tabletop RPGs, but they're a tool in the toolbox. So this is an interesting little framework. I won't dwell here too long, but this is sort of comparing tabletop RPGs to video games. And so there's been a ton of research on video games and learning. Probably the last 20 years, there's been loads of money, particularly from like Silicon Valley and other wealthy groups pouring money into researching how video games help learning. And it's very well established now that certain video games are very good at creating certain kinds of learning despite what maybe your parents told you in the 80s and 90s, or some people still today. But they're so some of our theoretical models are informed by research on video games and learning, but we're careful to sort of discuss when that research transfers and when it doesn't. And so here are some interesting distinctions between video games and tabletop RPGs. Um, Tabletop RPGs are analog, so we're not for the most part. Now there's digital tools we can do it remotely and so on and so forth. But when we really suggest to get the most out of this stuff, depending on your learning goals. But for instance, if you want to help students develop literacy skills, information literacy skills, research skills, having pen and paper and books is going to be much more helpful for them in terms of learning how to sort through complexity. If the work is all done for them on an automated system or a digital platform, they don't really have a chance to appreciate how to manipulate, how to understand that system and how to interface with that system and kind of reference those rules and understand how it's all built. So one of the interesting distinctions is that it's analog. And this for many parents and educators is a real boon because it gets students off the screens when sometimes that's hard to do. And so the fact that it is an analog game and students are still willing to play this game, even though it's analog, is a real power and a credit to the game itself. It's highly social, much more social than most video games are, particularly like having to have kids or people sit around a table for hours at a time in some cases. You know, it's perhaps the most intensely social thing. We see it, I would argue, in modern society. Where else do you see a small group of people or friends being in such close proximity and working in such close concert for such a concentrated amount of time? It's just hard to imagine another example. perhaps a holiday where they're, Thanksgiving and everyone's kind of locked in the house and cooking and eating and all this sort of stuff. But besides that, it really stands out as quite the cultural phenomenon. Um, Flexible, open-ended narrative. We can do things in tabletop RPGs we can't in video games because of the fact that it's mediated by a game master or a dungeon master, and the game master as facilitator allows you to kind of scaffold and respond to students and player choices in real time. Deliberative decision making. So there was a little bit of a framework for understanding how they might differ from video games and some interesting components of them. This is building on that, this was the title of our first chapter and our first major principle from the book, our textbook Adventures in Teaching Learning with Tabletop RPGs. And this is distinguishing two important terms. And these are thrown around a lot. And it's sort of a pet peeve of mine to talk about using tabletop RPGs as a form of gamification. Uh, I prefer the term game-based learning. And so
Yeah, gamification um, has gotten a pretty bad rap. It's been taken over by uh, companies who really just want to get educators to spend money. And so there may be some gamification purists out there who are still fighting the good fight, but um, I noticed this slide says school is already a crappy game, and it's true.
that's your quote. Yeah, that
That's
can,
my quote.
yeah.
All right, school is already a crappy game. It's we already have points and leaderboards and competition. So if we're doing now, we're just giving, badges out, and competitively working in teams of the kids who sit at the same table or something, right? And we have a leaderboard everyone can see. It's not changing the way that school is played. It's not change, it's the same mechanics, it's just a different window dressing, right? It's Monopoly School Edition instead of just
Right.
Monopoly. And so
Uh-huh.
game-based learning is really different because we're trying to make an adaptive change to what learning consists of in a classroom setting or in any other setting.
No, well put. Yeah. Gamification is that taking game like features or properties like points and badges and like timers and leaderboards, as you say, and applying them to learning. So it might be an app like Quizlet or Jeopardy, where we can take the content of our lesson or the unit and we can turn into like a flashcard game or something like this. Game-based learning, on the other hand, is more about the authentic of having students play games and understanding there's learning that happens from those games. And so we want to make sure that one of the key ideas here is play. And so that play, this is sort of the thing that happens often with gamification, is that we lose the actual fun.
Right.
There's not actually a real interesting or deep or fun or playful game under the hood of all that gamification. But instead, it's sort of like dopamine tunnels, right? It's sort of it's a psychology of like keeping people engaged without actually inviting them into play in a deeper way. And so game-based learning is really more about understanding how learning happens in good games, um, and the inherent learning that happens in well-designed games. And so we really, and a good litmus test is to say, is there play happening? Are my students really engaged in this game? Because it's just fun and inherently interesting to play. And so again, that's our first chapter in the book. There's a lot more content there, but those are two terms that are sort of a pet peeve of mine. And I wanna get a little more into play. And so there's two researchers here I'm going to reference as we talk about the seven properties of play. So the magic circle of play is a term that came from Huizinga from again about over 100 years ago, who did this first kind of book, this study of ludology or of play and culture. And he sort of recognized the importance and power in play and like human development. Um, and then Stuart Brown went on to identify seven different properties of play. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I want to highlight a couple of these. because they show some of the opportunities and challenges of using game-based learning in teaching and learning. The first one is what you're going to struggle with, some educators and parents struggle with, which is it's apparent purposelessness, that people have a hard time with play or fun. So even still today, people are like, well, we don't have time for this silliness, right? We just want to strip all the extra stuff down and get it down to what's the most efficient way to cram learning into my students so we can
Right.
do better on the tests, right? Versus understanding that taking some time to help have students create a character, go in their own direction, or kind of be responsive to personal learning is part of what makes a role play game so engaging, and inherently interesting to players. And so this apparent purposelessness, is one of the properties of play. Um, there's also this inherent attraction, and we've been talking about this in different ways so far. Our students are naturally drawn to this game. They want to play it because it's fun and fascinating. And so this is another great litmus test for, is this gamification or is this authentic game-based learning or play?
Well, and from a practitioner point of view with middle schoolers, some of my middle schoolers are so used to playing the school game and they know how to win that, or they've chosen not to play, that the apparent purposelessness and the sort of mushiness of there not just being one right answer and being asked to do things like be creative and come up with their own answers, it's attractive, but it can also be really challenging for some students who have lost that through being iPad kids or from,
Yeah.
or whatever. And so just because something's a game and there's an inherent attraction doesn't mean everyone's going to be good at it right away. And that's another thing that people will sometimes say is, well, what if they don't want to do it? Like, well, they don't want to take tests either, but here we are, right?
Ye-
And so,
Right.
yeah, and so they want to do it, but not all of them can right away. And so some of this will need to be scaffolded. And if you come across that, that's okay. That's very normal.
Oh, well, it's a great point. And, the voluntary aspect is an interesting one because vis-a-vis other learning activities, there is a level of coercion in school, right?
Sure.
Where it's like, hey, they need to follow along with the learning assignments, which is part of that game of school, which you speak about. And
Absolutely. And this is voluntary. Jumping into the magic circle is voluntary.
right,
I
exactly.
might, right, I might be forced to go through the motions because I'm in this class, but actually jumping in and becoming part of the pretend world, the fictional world of the game, is definitely voluntary. And it's really, really satisfying when you see kids who at first are worried to do that because that's not a thing that happens to them in a middle school setting typically, start to learn to jump in.
No, it's a good point. And yeah, that magic circle is really fluid and it's going to change throughout the course of a session. Some people are going to be in, some people are going to be out, some people we pulled in, so who's actually experiencing play, who's kind of in flow, really playing the game versus not, is something you're going to be able to pick out over time. And yeah, we're going to get into more about like how to help more kids invite them into the authentic magic circle as it goes.